Welcome, everyone, to the inaugural Daily Rex podcast. I'm Casey from thedailyrex.com, and I want to discuss some dinosaurs with you guys today. Normally, I would try to have a guest, and we would interview and talk about certain things, but being the first one, I think I just want to talk about some things that are going on in the paleontology world, specifically towards dinosaurs. So let's just start off right now. The biggest thing going on right now is the reality show on the Discovery Channel will premiere in a few weeks, called Dino Hunters. This has created quite a mixed group of feelings for people. There are a lot of people saying that this is glorifying the selling of dinosaurs, which are priceless. There are those who are worried about the content of it. I'm not going to talk about the content or talk about the show, basically because it hasn't premiered and no one's seen it yet. But what I do want to talk to you today is how commercial paleontology works. I have been involved in it for the last few years. I do not work in it full time. I am a biology teacher by trade. But let's talk about it for a little bit. What is commercial paleontology? Well, commercial paleontology is non-academics or non-governmental employees digging dinosaurs and making profits off that. And not just dinosaurs, all sorts of fossils. You can think the green river fish that you see everywhere, the Utah trilobites. Those are commercial paleontologists. There are different forms of that. There's some who dig and sell, some who do pay digs. Some they dig, have their own museum, display it in the museum, charge people to see their museum, and often sell replicas. Some do a kind of a mix of all three. There's actually quite a few private museums around the country. Most of the museums are actually private. So that's really what commercial paleontology is. It's basically non-academic or non-governmental people working in paleontology that basically are making money off it. Now in the United States, and that's what I'll be focusing on, is you have to navigate a myriad of laws to be able to sell fossils. Let's talk about federal law. That's the biggest thing. When it comes to federal law, to be able to sell fossils, you have to own the land. You can collect plant and invertebrate fossils on public land, mainly BLM. Not really on the Forest Service anymore, or it is illegal in national parks. But you typically cannot sell those plant or invertebrate fossils. And all vertebrate fossils on federal government land is illegal to collect at all. So private or commercial paleontologists, they have to either own the land or lease the land from someone who owns it. That is the only way they can sell something legally. There are some rare exceptions with very old collections, but we're not going to go into those today. So basically, they have to go on, either own the land or they talk to the landowner and get a lease and then pay the landowner a certain percent. So these are not people who are just going out, wandering around, and taking dinosaurs off the land, going on eBay and selling them. That is not how this works. That is illegal, and if anyone does it, they are not a commercial paleontologist. They are just poachers. So please don't. I urge everyone to refer to them as such and not really lump them in with everyone else. So through this show, there's been a lot of people saying things that it's theft, there's no scientific value in these fossils commercially, they're not collected right, and things like that. I'm going to really talk about that in a minute. As far as the collecting methods, well, some are great. We can't lump all of the commercial paleontologists in one group or another. I have seen some that take great notes. I have seen some that take very poor notes. And a lot of the United States ones are much better than, say, the ones from Morocco. And you really have to remember, a lot of fossils come out of Morocco. Morocco is a far poorer country, so a lot of these people are just trying to make ends meet. They're not really trained in it. Some are decent at it, but in general, I'm still going to focus on the United States with this. So when a commercial paleontologist finds a rather large, impressive, let's focus on dinosaurs, a dinosaur skeleton. These skeletons can be worth quite a bit of money. Some are not as much. I mean, I've seen some of the smaller skeletons go maybe $80,000, which sounds like a lot, and I've seen some of the very large skeletons of large carnivorous dinosaurs. They can go for millions. Everyone points to Sue, that sold for about $8 million. Nothing's ever really come close to that since, but people often view that as such. But there are some that go for millions. So let's talk about why would a dinosaur sell for, let's say, $3 million. Okay? And I've heard the things going, well, it should never be worth that. It's lost to science. And we'll go into the lost to science in a little bit. But let's talk about the time, cost, energy, and risk that comes with commercial paleontology. So first off, the time is probably the biggest factor in this. Commercial paleontologists have to spend the time to begin with to even get on the land or find the land or finance the land. And if you've ever dealt with trying to buy land just by buying land, loans for that is excessively difficult. But most of them usually go with leases. Now, leases are where you go up to a landowner, you get permission to look on their land, and then you make a deal with that landowner that you can excavate the fossils on the land that they own, sell them, and then that landowner gets a fixed percentage of whatever they sell for. That's probably the majority of it, but some actually can go out and buy land to do it themselves. It's always preferred that way. But to get on land and to get to that point is expensive. It is time consuming. For those who have done it, you have to have maps, you have to have contacts, you have to have a little bit of luck, you have to figure out where this person lives, because basically for a lot of these plots of land, people own these plots of land, they don't live on them. Trying to figure that out is very difficult, and trying to get in contact with them is even more difficult. So let's say you've somehow managed all those hurdles and you've got access to land and you're at the point where you sign a lease. So a lease is a nice legal binding agreement, which if you don't have a lease and you're digging dinosaurs, I would really recommend you always have a lease. The legal aspects, which I will talk about later, are very complex. So now you have the land. You know there's dinosaurs on it. You walk it, you find a spot, you find some bone, you maybe find a few shed teeth, and you go, well, I'm going to dig here. Sometimes you can get lucky, and you can find a good skeleton right away, eroding out of the hill. That's usually not the case. Most dinosaurs are broken, jumbled up, and in pieces. And a lot of the times you'll find 2 or 3 vertebrae, and then that's it. That's all there is of the dinosaur. Maybe a toe bone. It got washed down the river. You might find an articulated foot, and then there's nothing else of that animal. That is the common thing to do. You'll find teeth everywhere because dinosaurs went through teeth every 90 to 180 days. So that's probably the most common thing you find. And as you dig, you try to find a skeleton. That's the end goal. All the other stuff has value. Does not have as much scientific value because sometimes a single vertebrate is not really super valuable, or a single shed tooth. It has some value to the general population that would just like to buy them. However, scientifically, they typically do not have that much scientific value. So, a lot of the times you would quarry. You would find a spot that would look good and you would quarry this. Now, with commercial, they'll often work at the same quarry for an entire summer for 4 or 5 years. I've known some that work for 4 or 5 years. They pulled out lots of material, but they haven't really pulled out full animals. And they still continue to do so in the hope that a full animal is there. This isn't always the case with academics. There's a lot of ongoing quarries, but a lot of the times they kind of walk around because they have access to a lot more land, so they can hopefully find a skeleton quicker. But with commercial, it takes a lot of time, and just think of all the costs that go into it. If you're spending all that time and you're pulling out a leg bone here and a leg bone there, they sell all right, but if you know what it costs to basically make a living as a small business owner, because most of these are small business owners, so they have to find quite a bit of material to actually be able to do this as a job. And it gets difficult sometimes when you don't have the nice, robust skeletons. But let's say you get lucky and you find a 40-foot long, let's just go with T-Rex because that's what everyone likes to talk about. And let's say there's about 50% of them there, because it's very rare to find anything over 50%. The average dinosaur skeleton that we call skeleton is about 40% complete. So about half the bones are there, which is an amazing find. Let's say you found the skull. With a T-Rex, it's 40 feet long. Some of these bones are very large. Okay? So it's going to take an entire summer season likely to get them just prepped and ready to be taken out of the ground. That doesn't include getting them out of the ground and then to the lab or the warehouse to house them so you can actually prep them and make the bones look good. A T-Rex skull is going to weigh a tremendous amount. You're going to need very large equipment to lift that skull off the ground and put it on a vehicle that is actually able to travel on whatever road it was to get to where the T-Rex was. Because a lot of the times these are very remote places, so it's very difficult to get the right equipment out there to do it. So you've got all this manpower and hours just to dig it out of the ground. You have to spend all this money on either renting or buying equipment just to get it from the ground to the lab. Now, I said it can take an entire summer. I've known some that take 2 or 3 summers to get them out of the ground. If we're talking the big long-necked dinosaurs, they can take years and years and years and years, and their bones are so huge that you're transporting things is going to be very costly. But let's go back to the hypothetical of a T-Rex. You only have half of it. You have dug it out of the ground. You have jacketed it. You've jacketed what you need to jacket. And now it's in the lab. Let's say you lucked out and you spent an entire summer, which is about 3-4 months, which is sometimes all you get into digging. Sometimes you get a little bit more depending on the area of the country you're digging. And now you have it in the lab. Well, that 3 or 4 months was the short period of time to actually prep the fossils out of the rock with this. For every, it's kind of considered this, some can quibble with this and argue, for every hour you spend in the field, it's 10 hours in the lab. So now you're looking at an excess cost of, first off, you have to have somewhere to house it. These are excessively large bones. A T-Rex skull is huge and weighs tons because it's encased in that rock. You have to have something that can actually physically hold the skull and the hip. Those are typically the heavy portions. But if part of the chest is articulated, you want to keep that together as best you can. So just having a building to house it is expensive. Second, you have to have the tools. You have to have very large air compressors. You have to have very large air scribes and many air scribes. On an animal that size, you're going to go through several different air scribes, and those air scribes are hundreds of dollars each. But the biggest thing on that is obviously the human capital. You're going to have to pay people who know what they're doing to prep these fossils. And if I said it took almost a whole summer, 3 or 4 months, to get the animal out of the ground in a proper way, then you're looking at 10 times that. You're looking at 2 to 3 years to prep this half skeleton. That's 2 to 3 years you have to pay someone to do this. And if you know what people get paid and their wages and stuff like that, that cost adds up. So let's say you've prepped it. All the bones are out. They look pretty. Now you have to restore. A lot of these bones are going to be missing pieces. They're going to be missing chunks. And then they're going to be missing entire bones. You have to cast those bones. That is not all that simple. That is not all that easy. Let's say on Tyrannosaurus Rex you find the whole thing, but you don't find any feet. Both the feet on these guys are gone. You don't have anything to cast them as. This is where a lot of them try to work with institutions, work with other people to get access to their skeletons to be able to cast them. A lot of the times if you can't, you have to pay someone to do that, to even get access sometimes. So that is a cost on top of there. So you will spend, and that's part of that 2 to 3 years, you will spend that 2 to 3 years prepping this Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton, mounting it, filling in the broken bones, adding replicas for the bones that aren't there, and now you're 3 years out from where you found it, and you haven't made a dime off it. You have only spent money. And at this point, you have likely, being a Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton, you've likely spent $500,000. So right now, you are $500,000 in the hole. It is a tremendous risk. Unless you can figure out how to finance a large skeleton when you find it, it is very difficult. Some will sell it unprepped, and some institutions like that because they can get it cheaper, and that is something they do. But let's say you want to create that one skeleton that we all know, Sue, you want something to rival it. You've already sunk in $500,000. Okay? So Sue went for about $8 million. It really, most don't go that high, but let's say you put the price tag on this at $6 million. The reason for that price is the amount of time, the amount of risk, the amount of energy, the amount of cost that has gone into it. Okay? So if you're asking anything less than $1 million, you probably are losing money. Because when you sell that skeleton, you have to pay that landowner 20, 30, 40%, whatever your lease said it was. You have to pay them. So that's a cost you have to add into it. So you can't just sell it, oh, well, it costs $500,000 to prep and everything. I want to make $100,000. I'm going to sell it for $600,000. Doesn't work. You owe the landowner 20 to 30 or 40%. Now, you have the skeleton. It's worth a lot of money. And yes, private collectors want to buy them, and museums want to buy them. And I've heard it all the time. Museums don't have money to buy these skeletons. Well, they don't have money on hand to buy these skeletons, but most museums do something called development or fundraisers. This is how Sue is paid for. This is not uncommon. This is really common with most museums. Art museums do this all the time. But for some reason, it's okay for an art museum to do this, but it's not been okay for natural history museums to do this. I don't really know how that's happened in this discourse, but it's extremely common. The Smithsonian even buys skeletons. I know a few that have sold to the Smithsonian. Not some of the large dinosaurs, but some of the other ones. And they haven't sold for, $500, $600. They've sold for thousands of dollars. They do this through donors. Okay? And yes, the fact that some private collector can buy it can drive up the price. But typically when you get a really, really nice skeleton, and you have a few institutions who know that they have donors to buy them, they will be able to fundraise to an extent. And a lot of the commercial paleontologists will actually help them fundraise. They'll go do talks and things like that. Not everything goes to the auction block. Actually, most skeletons don't go to the auction block. They are sold at the large shows, or they're sold because you know someone. Okay, so we're looking at, and here's the other thing, is you have spent 3 years prepping, mounting, and filling in this skeleton. Now you have to find a buyer. Finding a buyer that has $5 or $6 million, that usually takes time also. And for anyone who's run business knows that that time really just sucks money. So you might spend 3 to 4 years trying to find a buyer for this skeleton. So you're 6-7 years into this, and you have yet to make a dollar of profit. The risk that goes into commercial paleontology, especially on these large dinosaur skeletons, is immense. So with that risk comes a high payout. And you might say, well, it shouldn't be sold for that much. And you can believe that. However, it does sell for that amount. That's just kind of how the market works. Okay? And we talked about that. I want to talk about public lands and why things happen and don't happen. And, you know, I hear all the time is that, well, you're taking these specimens away from science. That's debatable. And I'll probably do a podcast on that. We'll talk with someone later about that. But public lands, for those who don't live in the western United States, you don't really have many public lands. You have some state lands. The state lands are a little different than public, and sometimes their laws are different. But out here in the West, most of the West is owned by the federal government. BLM, Park Service, Forest Service, there are military, but those are the main ones. A lot of the tribes own quite a bit of land out here also. For those who don't know, 68% or so of the entire state of Utah is owned by the federal government. Okay? And it's something like 80% of Nevada. And a lot of the other states are 55% of the entire state is owned by the federal government. So in these states, which are the common ones that have dinosaurs, most of the land is not available to commercial collectors. All that land is available for academics, universities, BLM, paleontologists, things like that. They are available. However, there are some issues with that. Is that a lot of the times many institutions are only ever granted one permit on BLM land. That really restricts what they can do. So they can pick one formation. Well, I want to dig T-Rex. Well, we would rather dig an Allosaurus. Or we want to go after Utahraptor. These institutions have to choose. They can't really have 2 or 3 crews go into 2 or 3 different spots for different dinosaurs. They're kind of stuck. But on these public lands, here's the thing. Dinosaurs are not as rare as you think. I mean, there are rare skeletons. But I'll give you an example in Utah. And I'm not going after James Kirkland. James Kirkland is the director of paleontology in Utah. He's actually pretty good friends with a lot of the commercial paleontology. He doesn't necessarily come after us for what we do on private land. So I want to give him that shout out. But he has come out and said he will never dig a sauropod unless it's a titanosaur or a brachiosaurus. I mean, so that really leaves off, and when I say this, digging a sauropod in the Morrison Formation, which includes Camarasaurus, Apatosaurus, and Diplodocus. Those are the 3 really common ones. You find Camarasaurus is number 1. You find them the most. And I don't blame him for this. I talked about the time and energy it was to do a T-Rex. Imagine doing that on a 100-foot animal. Okay, Camarasaurus could be 60, 70 feet long, full grown. Most of them weren't full grown. You get them like 40, 45 feet long. So you're looking at a 5-year commitment on a Camarasaurus on public land where they don't have $500,000. And let's face it, there are dozens and dozens of Camarasaurus skeletons out there that have been found. Very few people can write papers on them. Things like that. So we have these entire bone beds in southeastern Utah that are just full of sauropods that no one's going to dig because it's not worth it, because the time and energy to do it is. Commercial paleontologists often would. They may actually just sell off bits and pieces here or there, and you can determine whether that's right or wrong. But if they are not dug up within either from one good rainstorm and one good winter to maybe a year or two, every fossil that is on the surface is going to be destroyed. This happens in Grand Staircase, the National Monument. Most of the dinosaur beds in Grand Staircase are actually still in the National Monuments. A lot of the stuff they took away really wasn't that portion. There were some parts, but they're still all protected. It is just as illegal to take it off BLM land as it is a national monument. The laws don't change for vertebrates at that point. In Grand Staircase, there's just bone everywhere. Hadrosaurs are very, very common. I've actually seen them. I've talked to the paleontologist. There's long strings of backbones of hadrosaurs that they just don't dig. They can't dig. They don't have enough resources. And in Grand Staircase, there's some particular plants that really get into these fossils. And when the roots get into the fossils, they suck out all the nutrients. Believe it or not, a lot of the phosphorus, nitrogen, and especially calcium are still in the bones after about 70, 75 million years. So they suck it out and they destroy the bones quickly. So anytime the bones are on the surface, plants are growing in them and sucking them out. So we have this dichotomy of, if it's dug, will it work? Work for science. That's not how it works. Most of the time, skeletons go undug and erosion takes them. And this happens all the time. I have found a whole stegosaurus skeleton, told the BLM, here it is. A couple years later, it's still there. It's completely gone. I know people have found whole Camarasaurus skulls. Beautiful. Perfect skulls. Told the BLM, here it is. Here's its location. If you don't get it soon, it's gone. And you know what? They don't have the resources to do it. Paleontology is more about a race against erosion than it is anything else. So when it comes to commercial, a lot of the times these private landowners, they're not going to let academics on their land. There are some exceptions, and they can still do that right now. But in general, they're not going to let people on their land to tear up their land, to potentially hurt their cattle, to potentially hurt their crops when they're not getting a financial gain. So what would happen most of the time if commercial paleontologists were stopped would be erosion would destroy most of those bones. Now, some people say that, well, that's all well and good because they have no scientific value. We'll touch on that eventually in a future podcast, but I'll be honest, this argument about commercial paleontology not having scientific value, that is a political argument, not a scientific one. And we'll go into that at some point. But I'm going to end with the one that's kind of caused the biggest headaches. The dueling dinos. This is the one where it's got the Triceratops and what some are calling the Nanotyrannus. I'm not going into Nanotyrannus versus Tyrannosaurus right now. Just don't want to do that. So a lot of this has come out and people have been talking about it lately that, well, this is a prime example of why dinosaurs should not be sold, is that this is a very important specimen. We can actually figure out if it's Tyrannosaurus Rex, juvenile T-Rex, or Nanotyrannus is different, things like that. And that this is why you can't sell them, because they're just going to sell it to the highest bidder and everything, and it's sat there and done nothing. Well, let's go into, I don't know every specific, but I do know it was dug up by people who do know what they're doing. It has been examined by the likes of Phil Manning and Bob Backer and Pete Larson. These are all people you should know, and they have said that it is prepped correctly. The location is and sites are recorded properly. And so some people are going, well, they're asking $9 million. Well, yeah, they are, because I explained why they are. Because it takes so much time, and basically because they can ask that because it can sell. And the biggest problem is it would have sold. That this would probably be in a museum right now if the dueling dinosaurs haven't been stuck in court for the last 5 years. And that's a separate issue. They've been stuck in court for 5 years, so they haven't been able to be sold. They haven't been able to be researched or anything like that. They have been stuck in a court case. And that court case was a question of actually who owned the fossil, the surface owner or the mineral rights owner. It has just been ruled that the surface owner owns fossils. That is good for everybody. And we will do a podcast on that at some point. But let's just touch on that. We don't know where it's going. We don't know who's going to buy it, but it finally can find a home. So I would just say, when you hear things about commercial paleontology, I want you to think about how it actually works. I'm not going to say all the commercial paleontologists do great science. I'm not going to say all of them really are positive representation. But when you start to hear some of these things about commercial paleontologists, understand that most of the people do care. They do this because they love it. Can you get rich off it? Yeah. Do most of them get rich off it? No, absolutely not. Most of them do not find that skeleton. And even if they do, T-Rex is the one that's worth the most. If you find a large carnivore, like say an Allosaurus, you're still spending that $500,000, but you're only getting maybe 1.5 to 2 million if you're lucky. All right. So I'm going to end on that note and just say, watch it. If it's sensationalized, well, that might be a problem for the industry. But don't be afraid to buy a dinosaur bone. Don't be afraid to buy a dinosaur tooth, or just have questions about it. Don't try to paint everything with a broad brush, that it's all evil or all not. Most commercial paleontologists are in it because they love it, because it's something that they have dreamed about and have done, and they are taking a tremendous risk. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this today. I don't know when the next one will be. I don't have a specific schedule, but I hope you guys have a good day, and I hope you've learned something.